Hi there, and welcome to Your Future, Your Finances, a show on Laurel TV where we have experts in their field who share stories and stats on current events for your education. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn. In this segment, we have the opportunity to discuss a variety of topics because we'll be discussing the polling data of the public with my guest, Mallory Newall of Ipsos. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Sure. So let's start with the tax legislation. It's a current event. It just happened. You had a report come out on it recently. Are people happy with the new tax bill? What does some of the data share?
That's a great question, Brian. So just to take a step back, what Ipsos does, it's a global public opinion research company. And we're responsible for conducting public opinion research constantly among the American public in this case on a wide variety of issues. We recently partnered with Reuters to conduct a poll at the end of March, so really at the height of tax season when people are looking to make their last minute filing to see what the American public thought about tax reform. And there's a big sense of uncertainty out there right now. The American public is basically evenly split. 1 in 4 say that they think that the plan will make them pay more in taxes. 1 in 4 say they'll pay less. 1 in 4 say there's probably no change. And another quarter of the American public just don't know or don't have an opinion. So as you can see, public opinion on taxes right now is pretty evenly split across the board.
Now, there was talk of the tax code being made more simple. That was one of the goals of the legislation, and that was some of the polling that you did, as I understand it, was whether Americans were looking to simplify the tax code or how they did that and whether this new legislation accomplished that goal?
That's right. Some of our recent polling that Ipsos conducted at the end of March also explored the idea of who would benefit the most from tax reform. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about who Americans think will benefit from tax reform and if they're the ones that will directly benefit. So more than 1 in 3 Americans said that wealthy Americans and another number, about 1 in 5, said that big corporations would be the most likely to benefit from tax reform. Now, about a year ago, when President Trump first introduced his tax plan, we conducted a poll. Ipsos partnered with NPR to basically assess where Americans were at prior to tax reform being released. And yes, you're right that a vast majority of the American public, nearly 9 in 10 Americans, say that the tax code in this country is far too complicated. So even going back a year, when this whole debate really started, you see that the landscape was really prime for a lot of uncertainty, but there was a clear sense that it's just far too complicated for the American public.
Now, the polling that you did, it appeared that one of the questions that you asked related to how they feel they will take action on the polling come November. This will be airing in the April timeframe. We have about 6 months to go. What does some of the polling suggest will occur later in the year?
That's right. That's a great question, Brian. I think that as we head into the midterm elections this November, Ipsos is putting out polls weekly in our partnership with Reuters about just generally where the American public is at when it comes to looking ahead for the midterm election. And I think right now one of the important things to note is that the attention span when it comes to various issues for people is very short. So there's always a new issue of the day, a new topic, a new news story. But when it comes to taxes and whether or not taxes are a driver for people's vote come November, for about half of the American public, just over half, they said that tax reform would make them more likely to vote for one party or another. In this case, tax reform gave the Democratic Party a slight lead, with just under a third of the American public saying that this issue would make them more likely to vote for a Democrat in November. And slightly less, about a quarter, 1 in 4, said that this issue would make them vote for a Republican. And the rest of the American public, just under half, said that this issue doesn't really make a difference in their vote. And we asked similar questions about the impact on other issues that are currently happening right now, such as healthcare, national security, things like that as well.
Your reports, they seem to distinguish between the party affiliation of the respondent, and the results are dramatically different in that area. Can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because one of the things that Ipsos finds in our polling, and one of the things that we've studied over time, is how a person's partisan affiliation has a dramatic impact and is currently the biggest driver for how they feel on any given issue. Partisanship has a bigger impact on somebody's views than, say, educational attainment or their age, for example. And what we found, so weekly we ask a question about what Americans think the main problem facing the country is currently. And each week, recently, healthcare, closely followed by terrorism, have been at the top of the list. But if you dig a little bit deeper, what we find is that it's really Democrats that are driving healthcare as the main problem facing this country, and it's Republicans that are driving terrorism as well. And those issues are followed by the economy generally, which is usually a third or fourth place concern, regardless of partisanship. But there's another issue in our list that I find really interesting, which is morality. And that can be defined for people, I think, in a number of different ways. But this notion of morality, or perhaps how people are interpreting it as a lack of morality, perhaps, is always quite a bit higher among Republicans. Morality, as of late, has been one of the top 2 or 3 issue concerns among Republicans, and it's much lower among Democrats. So again, yes, you do see issue variance with healthcare being a top concern for Democrats, terrorism, morality in this country for Republicans.
And within each party, do those issues change over time, or that's pretty constant? Those are their hot buttons.
That's a great question. I do think you see some fluctuation on issues within one's party affiliation. But what I think is important to take away is it's usually outside issues or events taking place that create a little bit of fluctuation here. So take, for example, after the Parkland school shooting in Florida, Ipsos and NPR partnered together to do a poll evaluating how Americans feel about gun violence and a number of gun violence prevention policies. One of the questions that we asked in that poll was, what are the top 3 issues you feel most worrying? So slightly worded differently, you're asking for what concerns you the most rather than the main problem facing the country. But after the Parkland school shooting, crime and gun violence rose to the top of the list. And what's interesting is we asked that very same question last fall. And there was a 10 percentage point increase in crime and gun violence. Now, of course, after a school shooting or another major event like that, crime and gun violence tend to spike a little bit. But I think what's important is to keep an eye on it and see how it trends over time. And in some of our other research we've conducted lately, it remains still one of the top 1 or 2 issues in this country. So there's certainly some variance among partisanship here, that crime and gun violence does tend to be a bigger concern for Democrats and independents actually as well. But it's also the issue factor and the major events going on in this country. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, one thing with polls that gets a lot of news is the variation between polling companies, or how do you know which one's accurate? So how do you take into account the accuracy of the polls, or some of the news that where the polls will be the same questions even could be different across the polling firms?
Sure. So I think that there's a number of factors that come into play here. And One thing that I'd like to note is there's actually been outside analyses done on how accurate various pollsters are in their work. There was an independent analysis done by 538.com during the 2016 presidential race, where they analyzed many, many different polls from different pollsters and found that Ipsos got an A rating in terms of our methodology, our accuracy. So one of the most accurate polling companies at that time for the 2016 presidential race. And I think what's important to note when you're looking at the accuracy of polling here is to first ask, what's the mode that this poll is being conducted? Is it a phone interview? Is it an online interview? Because that inherently may not necessarily change the accuracy, but it could affect the results. You ask questions, for example, differently on the phone than you might do online. But I think it's also, when you're thinking about making sure that your polling is accurate, for us, it's really important to ensure that we're talking to a representative sample of the American public and making sure that our polling reflects American demographics and what this country looks like as a whole. So relying on things like census data, for example, to make sure that your demographics are in line and you're talking with truly a representative sample of what this country looks like now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there was another report, I found it interesting, on self-driving cars. Unfortunately, that's in the news because of the accident that occurred, or multiple instances where they've had. But you actually have done polling on how people feel about that concept on autonomous cars and autonomous driving. What were some of the results of that?
Yes, that's correct. Ipsos actually did a global poll on self-driving cars. So what we did was conduct a poll in more than 24 countries around the world to basically see how people's views here in America stack up against views on this topic among people in the UK, for example, or Japan or China.
Right.
And that 28-country poll is actually something that we do regularly, monthly in fact, on a wide variety of issues. But when it comes to self-driving cars, I think you're right. There is certainly a little bit of apprehension mixed with curiosity here. So a majority of the American public currently thinks that we asked a question to gauge their level of interest. And they're interested in self-driving cars, but have some questions about safety. And it was only about 1 in 4 Americans that said, I'm very interested in self-driving cars and I would drive one or I would own one.
How much?
1 in 4.
1 in 4?
Yeah.
Really?
So over half of Americans, I think, are open to the idea, but may still have some questions. And then there's another quarter of the American public that is pretty set on these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to do it. You could take a nap on the DC Beltway while you're going to your next appointment. But well, that's great. Appreciate all of the information. How can we find Ipsos and you online?
You can go to our website, ipsos.com/en-us. That's, as I mentioned, Ipsos is a global company, so that'll take you to our US website and US polling data. You can also find us on Twitter at Ipsos News and Polls or Ipsos US.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That wraps it up for this segment. We will have another guest coming up. Thank you again for watching Your Future, Your Finances. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn.
The entire time I knew him, he only ever had one goal. To wipe out half the universe. If he gets all the Infinity Stones, he can do it with the snap of his fingers. Just like that.
Tell me his name again.
Thanos.
We got one advantage. He's coming to us. We have what Thanos wants. So that's what we'll use.
Let's talk about this plan of yours. I think it's good, except it sucks. So let me do the plan, and that way it might be really good.
Wow.
The end is near. When I'm done, half of humanity will still exist. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. I hope they remember you.
I'm Peter, by the way.
Doctor Strange.
Oh, you're using your made-up names. Then I am Spider-Man.
Hi, and welcome back to Your Future, Your Finances. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn. In this next segment, we're going to talk about economics and the health of our country. My guest is Brendan Greeley of the popular blog AllWeKnowSoFar and formerly a contributor to Bloomberg and The Economist. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian.
There's a lot of topics going on right now that are helpful to consumers and investors to be aware of. One of them is tariffs.
Yeah.
That's in the news today. They're implementing tariffs. They're reacting with additional ones. Why do you think they're doing that, and what's the goal?
Well, Donald Trump talks about when he was on the campaign trail, he would talk about trade, and he was surprised at the reception it got. And I think that there's something that people who write about economics and cover economics, people who work in Washington missed over the course of about a decade in America, which is that there were very destructive consequences of trade, in particular trade with China, that we didn't really talk about. Mm-hmm. And so he picked up on that, and that's to his credit. We didn't really talk about trade. It was just sort of something quietly that both parties supported that had huge effects on people in America, but we didn't really fight about it at the national level. We hadn't for a while. So the problem is, when we talk about tariffs, when we talk about trade, we're really talking about 5 or 6 different issues. We're talking about the fact that many industries in America disappeared very quickly, much quicker than industries normally disappear, over the course of about 5 years, because it was so much cheaper to do it in China. Furniture, just poof, gone. Apparel, poof, gone. And so all the towns that made these things had to adjust very quickly. It's very hard to adjust very quickly when the single largest employer in your town disappears. There wasn't any help from the federal level to try and figure this out. People were basically on their own. They got, I think, justifiably angry about that. The problem with that is that problem, though the consequences are not over, what's causing it is slowly disappearing. Wages are rising in China. So China wants to go for other industries. They're no longer competing with those industries that basically disappeared in America. So that's one issue. And the problem there is the problem has already happened. We can't go back and fix that problem. We can't magically recreate the furniture industry with new tariffs. Mm-hmm. There's another problem, which is that China is definitely stealing intellectual property. On the one hand, when a country develops, it often steals ideas from other countries. In the U.S., we completely stole the mechanized loom technology from the U.K. In the 19th century, right? All of those water-driven plants up in New England were just completely lifted. Apprentices would leave, they would take diagrams with them, they would arrive in America, and they would sell those diagrams. So we did that as part of our development process. China is now doing it as well. So that is a separate issue, and it's definitely worth a fight. And it's one that had only been quietly happening, not publicly happening, between the administrations before this administration. There's another problem, which is that China makes too much steel. They definitely do. They know they do, and many countries have been frustrated with this. This is something that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, this is an international organization that sort of works with developed economies to gather statistics. They've said this for a while. There's huge overcapacity on Chinese steel. Now, these are 4 or 5 different problems. I think I just listed 3. There are more. There are different solutions to each of these problems. I would argue that a lot of the Chinese problems, the way you fix them is by working with other developed economies and presenting a united front where they can all get together and go to China and say, look, you cannot drive down steel prices like this anymore with cheap steel exports everywhere. Or look, if you want to be selling things to our economies, you're going to have to respect basic international intellectual property standards. And there's some indication that China might be willing to do that if presented with enough pressure. The problem is the Trump administration is now having, I think, correctly recognized that there are several different problems with trade that had not been addressed before, is now just randomly lashing out in all different directions. And so we're angering European allies that we really need when we want to present this united front to China. And I think they're also wildly inconsistent. They're saying different things for different reasons on different days, and so nobody really knows internationally which thing to take seriously. So I would say the short version of what I just said is there's definitely a series of problems with trade. I'm glad that an administration is finally taking them seriously. Now, is it handling them with seriousness? I don't think so, and I wish for more seriousness, because basically what he's doing is he's saying, you need to lower our trade deficit. And we cannot get into the economics of trade deficits right now. There isn't time. But basically, no single other country can come to us and fix our trade deficit. That's something that we've got to do with fiscal policy, with trade policy, with a bunch of other things.
Mm-hmm. So to the extent you can forecast things like this, what do you think is the worst case and best case scenario on how the tariffs play out?
I think we're in the worst case scenario.
Right now we are?
Yeah, because countries will do ultimately what's in their best interest, right? It's very difficult to get Germany, for example. Germany sells too much to the rest of the world, doesn't consume enough at home. There's an imbalance there. They have a trade surplus with everybody. It's very difficult to get them to do what's not in their best interest. The best thing that you can hope to do is, on the margins, by cooperating with other countries, get things to slowly improve. I don't see that's happening. Mm-hmm. I see us on the margins sort of annoying as many different countries as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's another problem, which is that the other way in which I think that we're in the worst case scenario is that one huge problem with trade, particularly with Mexico and China, was that it took away lower skilled jobs. Now, you can argue that perhaps we want lower skilled jobs to disappear in America, right? We want to move up what they call the value chain and get higher skilled jobs. We can do that. But if we want to do that, we need to make it a conscious policy, and we need to work towards making sure that people get the right education, making sure that they're able to move, making sure that they can take their health care benefits with them. These are a bunch of things that we need to spend money on that we've been reluctant to spend money on. I don't see anything that indicates that we're going to start taking that seriously at all. So you asked what the worst case scenario is. The worst case scenario is this. We're sort of floundering around without a clear plan, having recognized a real problem without a serious way to address it.
So the tariffs they've implemented already, how do we know when consumers here start feeling that?
I think it's very difficult, particularly on, we haven't really implemented the aluminum and steel tariffs. We're still trying to figure out sort of who might get an exception. Will the Europeans get an exception? Will the Japanese get an exemption? The problem is twofold. One is the price of aluminum, for example, is already going up just with the threat of tariffs that don't yet exist. Luckily, aluminum is a relatively low-cost input into the final price of a can of beer that you might buy. So it's unlikely to change prices. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, we're taking on China with these tariffs. A lot of the low-cost stuff like shoes and apparel that China manufactured a while ago is now moving to other places. It's being manufactured in Indonesia and Vietnam. These are places with even lower labor costs than China has. So I don't really think that this is going to affect the price of a shirt at Walmart anytime soon. The consequence seems to be not economic but political. Again, as we sort of randomly lash out at different countries for different reasons at different times, the only thing we're accomplishing is that we're annoying as many people who are in other countries and run other countries as humanly possible. And I think that's a sort of brutally efficient the way we're doing that. I think I would be hard-pressed to say, how could you annoy more countries more quickly?
Okay.
Sorry, I'm deeply skeptical about all this, but I will say one thing in favor of the Trump administration. They do talk about trade. And I think other administrations, both Bush administrations, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, sort of hoped that trade would work out for everybody and did what it is that the elites of both parties really wanted, which was more trade deals.
Okay, so at least it's being discussed.
At least it's being discussed, yes.
On another topic, national debt, our country's debt. You wrote an article in the March timeframe using an analogy of going to buy a car.
Yeah.
Can you walk through that?
Yeah, sure. When you buy a car, what they're advertising is the car payment. They don't advertise the cost of the car. They advertise no money down, $350 a month. This car is yours. Drive away. Because that's the way we think. A lot of us think not in terms of sort of long-term value, but in terms of short-term cash flow. And I don't even think that's a human failing. I think our lives are organized in months. We get a monthly salary. We pay a monthly rent check. We have a monthly car bill, and so our brains process things in terms of what do we have to do every month in order to have the privilege of this car. So if interest rates are low, the car is going to feel cheaper every month. Your house is going to feel cheaper every month through the mortgage. That's what's been happening with the national debt. Even though we've been borrowing more, at the same time that we've been borrowing more, you can watch these two graphs cross, right? The interest rate has been slowly going down for 25 years now. And the national debt has been, sort of popped up in the early 2000s and, of course, skyrocketed right during the recession. We haven't felt that because our monthly debt service costs haven't increased that much. That's amazing, right? Despite the fact that we're borrowing ever more, because the rate of interest has gone down, what we're feeling every month in the same way that you feel your car payment every month hasn't really changed, right? What we're feeling every year. So the pain of debt is not something that we've noticed at all. And I think people don't do anything about debt until they feel the pain. Now, there are a lot of different theories about how much a country can borrow before it gets in trouble. There are theories that you can't borrow any more than 70% of your gross domestic product. That's about where we are now. Before you start to feel the effects. You pay too much debt service, you can't pay for things you need. There are theories that it can't get above 100. That's where we're supposed to be in about 10 years. Japan is at 245%, and they still exist as a country, right? Japan has huge demographic problems, but they're not collapsing as a country. Japanese yen-denominated assets are still seen as safe assets. When investors start to freak out, they buy Japanese debt. It's still considered a good deal, right? So could we get all the way up to 245% of GDP? I don't know. My goal is, let's not find out.
Yeah.
Let's not push it until it breaks. But the problem is it's very difficult to get both families and democracies to spend less money until they start to feel the pain of the consequences of that, until they start to lose credit. We've got credit. We're still a safe asset, so we haven't felt any pain yet.
Now, along with the debt and the health of the country, there's our currency. If a consumer is watching this that doesn't necessarily interact with currency other than their own money in their wallet, what do you think they should know about the value of our dollar or the value of other currencies?
I think it's important to not be alarmist about the value of the dollar. Again, I don't think we should test this, but there's no comparably safe asset, right? What I mean when I say a safe asset, you know what this is, but for the benefit of the audience, you have big risks that you take. If you're going to buy debt, you buy Argentinian debt, right? Argentina just released a 100-year bond. That's a risk. I did not take it. But if you just want to make sure that a certain portion of your income is safe, then you buy safe assets. And those are really it's the debt of a few countries. It's the US, it's Switzerland, it's Sweden, Denmark in particular for reasons that we can't get into, Japan, right? These are considered safe bets. And so because of that, those currencies are considered reserve currencies. Despite what the Chinese want to do, there is no contest globally for reserve currency. The dollar is still the reserve currency of choice. Ironically, as we borrow more and as our debt costs increase, meaning we pay more to borrow money, that makes dollars even more attractive because the returns you can get on holding things that are denominated in dollars get even higher. So I do not see a scenario where within the next 5 years, the value of the dollar plummets and we can't buy anything from abroad. Even if that happened, we have the biggest economy in the world, the most diversified economy in the world. We can buy things from ourselves without having to buy things internationally. Again, it's not the route I choose to go down. But the point is, so that's there's no imminent catastrophe with the dollar. I do think things are slowly shifting. America has what economists call an exorbitant privilege, I think is what it's called. It's a quote from an annoyed French finance minister from the 70s, which is that everybody needs our dollar. Because if you're going to maintain a central bank anywhere in the world, you have to be holding dollars. You have to be holding bonds that are denominated in dollars as part of your store just to manage your own currency, right? So that's our privilege. I do think that privilege will not disappear, but it will start to fade, right? I do think that over the course of the next 10 years, the US dollar is going to become a smaller part of that bundle. There are tiny indications of that happening. They're not major indications that that's happening. And as that happens, again, we're going to get to the point where it's going to be more difficult for us to borrow. It's going to be more expensive for us to borrow. And we're going to start to feel a little bit of pain. I would argue that a little bit of pain is not a terrible idea right now. I do think that we're on an unsustainable debt path. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I would like a sort of shot across the bow for the U.S. to get us to start thinking about debt differently.
Yeah. Now, the last topic we can cover here, there's this concept of wage increases. They've been flat over an extended time period. It doesn't seem that there is any obvious reason why that's the case.
Yeah.
There's a lot of theories, but why do we think wages have been stagnant over time?
Yeah, we're talking about American families haven't gotten a raise in 20 years. It's really extraordinary. Every once in a while, the profession of economics breaks, and then they have to pick up pieces and figure it out. That's what's going on right now with
on
wages.
that topic?
Yeah. I do think that one way to look at it is the percentage of national income that goes to workers as opposed to the percentage of national income that goes to people who own companies. That has dropped over the last 30 years, or around the same time. And I think that one of the fallacies is that we try to pick out one individual cause, right? We say it's about unions, right? The decline of unions means that workers have less bargaining power. That's certainly true. You could say it's about minimum wage, right? We don't have regular hikes in the minimum wage. It's not tied to inflation, right? So we're constantly playing catch up with the minimum wage. You could say that it's about something that economists have been talking about a lot recently, something called monopsony power, which is sort of a word that has long existed, but we hadn't talked about in a while. It basically means if a monopoly is one seller of an asset, of something, a monopsony is one buyer, right? So if I'm the only company in a town, I have a monopsony on jobs in that town. I'm the only one buying people's labor. And so there's some increasing evidence and empiric evidence, not theoretic evidence, actually going out looking at the data, that in a town-by-town basis, in towns that have more consolidated sources of jobs, wages are lower. All of this comes down to bargaining power. The problem is economists don't talk about power. Economists generally talk about fiscal policy, and they talk about monetary policy, and there's this relationship that we've always sort of looked at between interest rates and unemployment rates, right? And sort of this regularly is, the unemployment rate goes down. In theory, that's supposed to raise inflation because people ask for higher wages, and then you have to raise interest rates to counteract that, right? That's the basic model. That model doesn't work anymore. And I think that economists and policymakers are having a really hard time grasping that this thing that we've relied on forever, that we pull the handle and the treat doesn't come out. It doesn't work anymore. And so the problem is all of these things together that I just listed, the problem of monopsony employer power, the problem of the minimum wage, the problem of declining unions, they all come down to something that is very uncomfortable for both politicians and economists to talk about, which is power. We like to talk about money. We like to pretend that power doesn't exist. I think that all of these things add up to, for a couple of different reasons, workers have less bargaining power. And so even though the conditions would say they should get a raise, they are unable to compete for a raise. There's one small thing that's happened, for example, which is that non-compete clauses have blossomed. They're everywhere. It used to be just if you were in a high power position at in management in a firm, you had to sign a non-compete clause. I'm not going to leave and take my talents to another firm. Now it happens to sandwich shops. I'm not going to name any names because I'm not completely sure, but I seem to remember that one sandwich shop in particular, a national chain, actually had a non-compete clause for its sandwich assemblers. And I think that's unreasonable, right? But what it does is it prevents them from quitting and going to another job and asking for more money. All of these things together is basically an environment where it's very difficult to ask your employer for more money. And so how will that change? It changes when we start thinking about jobs differently. I don't know how to fix that.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Brendan Greeley of AllWeKnowSoFar. How can people find you online?
At AllWeKnowSoFar on Twitter, spelled the way you think it is, and also allweKnowSoFar.com. Please sign up for the mailing list. I send out economic research notes, or you might just call it a newsletter, 2 or 3 times a week.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for watching Your Future, Your Finances. That'll do it for this show. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn, and we'll see you next time.